Well, of course, we shouldn't be watching RT because it gives the microphone to people like Dan and myself to critique Western policies. And of course, we can't have that. We shouldn't have a station broadcasting in Britain that doesn't exclusively rely on neoconservatives or the fake left to talk about foreign policy, should we? So, yes, Dan's book is absolutely brilliant. And I think it's one of the most important books that I've read, one of the book that really should be distributed and publicised as widely as possible, because it really does shatter all the lies, all the propaganda that we've heard in the past 20 years regarding what's been going on. And it's interesting we're meeting today on the 8th of November because, as I'm sure most of you are aware, it's the anniversary, the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we're having all these programmes on the television about it. And remember, if anybody can think back to that time, 1989, 1990, when the Berlin Wall came down, we were all told we were going to look forward now to this peace dividend. We're going to have the end of hostilities, the Cold War. We're going to have a wonderful period of peace where all this money that was spent on weaponry could be put in the health service and education. And we all know what happened. We've had a quarter of a century of war after war after war after war. And that the fall of the Soviet Union, far from ushering a period of peace, has actually led to a period of heightened and even more aggressive policies from the US and its allies, because they had this period, particularly in the 1990s, when there was nobody really to check them. And what we've had has been a period, as I said, of continual war. It's very important, I think, to understand that these wars are all connected, all part of the same war for total Western global control and domination, because part of the genius, if you like, of the new imperial project has been to kind of divide opinion, and particularly to get so-called progressive opinion to support these new wars of imperialism. Because you know, it's actually also this week the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence, and of course most on the left wouldn't need any kind of explanation as to what that was about. It was about clearly a classic anti-imperialist struggle. But the wars that we've had in the last 20 years have been very cleverly packaged and promoted, in many cases, as progressive ventures. And we've seen large sections of so-called left, or I call them the faux left, actually cheerleading and actually being in the forefront of these aggressive imperialistic ventures. And that has confused a lot of people, because if it was just, you know, Dick Cheney or George Bush figures doing this, then of course a lot of people would be able to see who these people are. But it's been so-called progressives who have been, in many of the cases, who have been at the forefront of the propaganda campaigns. And I think that, so that's a very important point to bear in mind. And we look back at these wars, we have the 1990s, we have the assault on Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was, of course, billed as a humanitarian intervention. Again, we saw sizable sections of the left actually supporting that war and seeing it as something progressive. In fact, it was a destruction of a socialist economy, which had about 60-70% of the economy in public ownership. It was a war which we see, what Dan was just talking about, the strategy was to back terrorist proxies, in that case the Kosovo Liberation Army, who were trained and financed by the Western powers, the US, Germany and Britain, precisely in order to kill servants of the Yugoslav state in order to get security backlash from Belgrade, which would then be used to be hyped up as genocide, hyped up as war crimes, then be used as a massive NATO intervention. And that was the model used in 1999. Then, of course, we go into the new century, and we have step up a gear with the invasions of Afghanistan and, of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, what makes these interventions different? Dan explains in his book, and the title explains really his thesis, Divide and Ruin. Because if you think back to the old imperial wars, the old imperial campaigns of the West, then often it was the case of toppling a leader who was independent, who didn't do what the US and the Western financial elites wanted, and replacing him with a stooge. That was the classic move, the classic South American model, wasn't it, really, when you think about getting rid of Allende, putting Pinochet in, and in Indonesia getting rid of Sukarno and putting Suharto in. And then Indonesia becomes basically a Western colony. And that was the pattern that we saw applied in many countries. But what the US has been doing, certainly in the last, since Iraq, and Iraq was part of this, was actually to divide, the strategy was actually to destroy the country itself, to ruin the country. And this is what Dan explains in his book, that the strategy look at Iraq, the strategy in Iraq wasn't simply to replace Saddam Hussein with a US puppet. The strategy was quite clearly to destroy that country. And it sounds quite shocking to think. Many people wouldn't want to actually believe this, because it means that the leaders of the West are really even more depraved than many people think they are. But if we think about it logically, there is no other logical explanation of what happened in Iraq. Because the Western powers did everything they could to make sure that would not be a functioning country, everything they could to make sure that sectarianism would grow up, everything they could to make sure that civil war would follow. If they had merely wanted to replace Saddam Hussein with a pro-Western stooge, they could have done that. They could have done deals with people in the ruling party. They wouldn't have destroyed the entire infrastructure. They wouldn't have destroyed the entire security apparatus. They would simply replace one person with another. No, the aim was to destroy Iraq. And when people say, oh, well, the problem with Iraq was that really Bush and Blair didn't really have a plan for after the invasion, that was the plan. There was no plan, that was the plan. And the same applies, exactly the same, with Libya. We hear this saying, well, it was a good idea, Gaddafi was an evil dictator. Trouble was that Cameron and Sarkozy, they didn't really plan enough for afterwards. Well, exactly, that was the plan. What's happening in Libya today, a country where none of us can set foot in because it's too unsafe, that was the plan. Libya is destroyed. And why have they done this? Well, the thing is that, as Dan explains in his book, is that Iraq, Libya and Syria, all independent, strategically important countries. And the US basically couldn't trust the fact that simply getting rid of one leader would actually work. Because what would happen is that with the rising economic power of China, it's not possible to ensure that the person you put in will stay loyal to you anymore. And that's the big problem that the empire's got. I've just written a piece about what's going on in Hungary, which is quite extraordinary. Within the EU and NATO, you've got a country coming under enormous pressure from America, threats, banning Hungarian officials from entering America, simply because Hungary is keeping business deals and good commercial links with Russia. They cannot even control countries in the EU anymore. So their decline in economic power means that this strategy of merely getting rid of one leader and placing another doesn't work. And the beauty of this strategy from their point of view is that Iraq, in the foreseeable future, for many, many years, can never really be a strong independent actor in that region. Libya will never be a strong independent actor in that region. Syria was a strong independent actor in that region, but Syria has, of course, been greatly weakened by what's been going on with the Western-backed proxies fighting there to try to bring down the government. And this strategy, it's very important to understand that the strategy is to divide and ruin, not merely to regime change and replace one person with another. So I think that's what Dan brings to the table, literally in this book, extra to what other writers haven't been able to put in, is that thesis, which I think has been borne out totally with the events. And of course it benefits US's strongest ally in the region, Israel. Because I think Dan has quoted, in another article I read of yours recently from an Israeli academic paper back in 1982, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
In which he talked about actually the aim of Israel should be to actually help to destroy these independent countries. Would be the best possibility of Israel's security longer term, or Israel's for Israel, would be basically if Iraq and Libya and Syria were completely knocked out of the game. And Egypt. So I think that's a very important thing that Dan brings to the table. The other two other very important, I think, points that Dan makes in the various chapters is he really exposes the racism that underpins much of Western policy, and particularly the racism that underpins this so-called progressive doctrine of liberal interventionism. Because it's quite ironic, you've got people who claim to be anti-racist, liberals, leftists, who are actually supporting the violent, aggressive wars against independent countries. And if you think about it, it is inherently racist, because liberal interventionism is basically saying we, certain countries in the West, have the right to invade and attack other countries in the South, the Middle East, other parts of the world, Africa. But they, the countries in Africa or the Middle East, have absolutely no right to do the same to us. We are the arbiters. We decide this is good for you. Bombing is good for you. Syria, we need to bomb Syria because it's good for the Syrian people, it's good. And this faux concern that we get. And I'm afraid that I'm a journalist, and I'm afraid the British media has been infected by, certainly on the left, by this sort of band of columnists who are these sort of laptop bombardiers who claim to be progressives. Extremely patronising view of other countries. And Dan exposes this when we think about Libya, and we see how the West connived working with racist fanatic groups that targeted black Africans, massacring them. We've seen this in other countries too, in fact in the Ukraine, where we see the West siding with some of the absolutely reprehensible far-right neo-Nazi types in the Ukraine. The arson of a trade union centre in which 50-odd people, how many people it was, but scores of people burned alive, and these were the people backed by the West. So there is an inherent racism behind this theory of liberal interventionism, because it's not, the other side doesn't have the right to even comment on our. Can you imagine if the Syrian government had said we need to have intervention against Britain because of its policies on Northern Ireland in the 1970s? It had been totally denounced as outrageous. How dare the Syrians tell us what to do on Northern Ireland? But we've got the right to say Syrians should do what Libyans should do. And so this is the new imperialism, and I find the new imperialism actually more nauseating even than the old imperialism, because the old imperialism said we are the British Empire, as bad as it was, etc. However, there was a kind of honesty about it which is lacking from today's imperialism, which goes under a human rights progressive banner often, when in fact it's absolutely the opposite of being progressive, because it means siding, as Dan has outlined, with some of the most reactionary forces in the world today, most extremist forces. So I think that's another thing that Dan brings in this book, this critique of liberal interventionism and how dangerous it is and how we need to expose it for what it is. I think the third thing that Dan brings to the book is, there's a brilliant chapter in the book called When Are Humans Not Humans? And he talks about the way in which these thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers who are defending countries of the south, like Libya or Syria, have been murdered, have been killed in terrorist attacks by Western, and these people are non-people. They're not even considered in the casualty figures. So if you're in the Syrian army or the Libyan army, you're a non-person. You could be massacred. And Dan details how many Libyan soldiers were actually incinerated by NATO, basically. And they don't count. You know, they are unpeople. And this is all done, of course, in a sort of for civilization and for progressive causes. So I think that Dan's book is a must-read, and I think that I've quoted it extensively in articles I've written, and I've even mentioned it in RT interviews. I think it's so important because he really does. His analysis is absolutely borne out by the events, and I don't think we can understand what's going on today without understanding that there's no mistake in what's going on. As a journalist, if you write about Iraq, you're allowed to criticise it and say, oh well, perhaps it wasn't the right thing. You're expected to say it was a mistake. It was no mistake. What's happened in Iraq was what they wanted to have happened in Iraq. The strategy, as we see now from Syria, is this phony war. I've called it a phony war against ISIS. The main aim of the imperialist powers is still to destroy Syria and to get rid of the Assad government, which, as Dan says in another very important chapter in the book, the war on Syria is the war against Palestine. Very important to understand that, because if the Syrian government goes, Hezbollah and a war with Iran will come soon. So, you know, it's very important for us to understand this strategy. I just want to quote from the first chapter of Dan's book. He said here, the Iraq war turned what used to be treated as a conspiracy theory the notion that Western governments were prepared to slaughter hundreds of thousands of innocent people in unprovoked acts of aggression to further their imperial interests into incontrovertible common knowledge. It is common knowledge, and thanks to books like Dan and to people who have exposed the truth. I just want to end by on an optimistic note, because what has happened has been appalling. How can we together fight back against this process? Well, I think it's very important that we're not divided by the pro-war imperialist side, because I think their strategy is to divide and to distract, if you like, is to put people. So, for example, if you think back at Yugoslavia, the neocons, people who supported that war, posed as the protector of innocent Muslims. The same people who are supporting and cheerleading for Israeli Operation Cast Lead, all of a sudden become protectors of Muslims in the Balkans. So I think we've got to expose the fact that these people, their agendas, because they're very clever. Yugoslavia managed to divide the anti-war movement because they managed to try to get people to think that the West was suddenly being benign and kind to protect Muslims. The demonisation of the leaders of the country concerned is something we've got to confront, because you find yourself, even on the anti-war movement, when you give a talk, having to spend 10 minutes sort of denouncing the leader of the country being targeted. I think that's very important. We cannot say anything good about the country, but these countries are being targeted by the imperialist powers. So I think we have to accept. We shouldn't be intimidated into saying that we have to go on the back foot and start to talk about Syria, spending 15 minutes denouncing President Assad. So I think that we need to. The positive thing is that this has now gone on now 15 years. So, well, how many years it's gone on since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's surely becoming apparent to more and more people what the process is. And so I think that we have now got a media, we've got RT, we've got other alternative channels. We don't have to rely on the BBC for our news. So I'm quite optimistic that this process is actually in decline, and the fight back is beginning. The Syrian government is still there. People are waking up to what's going on. Israel hasn't got the victories that it wanted. So I think that we have to remain optimistic. And I think that really one of the most radical things that to help the cause you can do simply is to tell people to buy this book and to spread it around and to spread the word. Thanks.